Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. In this video is going to be a video on understanding backend web development concept. So the ideas here are just universal backend development ideas, regardless of whether you're programming in Node, Ruby, Python, C Sharp, Java, any language, and you're doing backend development, the concept here is the same. Okay, so we're going to kind of walk through several different layers and just kind of understanding how the interwebs work. So first, let's just kind of start there. Okay, so the idea is you have the client. Okay, whenever we say the client, we're referring to the browser, the person who is going to your website in their computer. So they're typing, let's say, xyz.com. So let's actually write that down. Okay, and let's make the font color white. Okay, so it might be like https www.xyz.com / about me, and then maybe you see something like this at the end of the URL. Okay, so this is like the URL you send in the browser. Okay, and we'll come back to that and break that down a little bit here. But you type that into a browser, the client, and then the client just doesn't magically just like have the information. It's going to send a request out. Okay, it's kind of like you ordering something on Amazon. You're sending out a message saying, hey, I want this thing. Okay, and in this request, so let's see here, what arrows we got. Okay, you send out this request via the browser. Okay, and whenever the browser, if you're entering something into a browser bar like here, the default kind of request that gets made is called a GET request. Okay, is a GET request. We'll talk more about different types of requests later on. Okay, it's making a GET request. And that's going to find its way through the internet. Basically what it does, it goes to your router, and then to your modem, then to your internet service provider. Then it goes to this place called DNS, the domain name service, where it will then look. So basically, this is going to determine how it's sent. That's the protocol. This is the host. So essentially what's going to happen is that, and again, let's just label these protocol. This is the host. This is the endpoint. And then this is the query. Okay, so those are the different parts of the URL. Okay, and we'll make all those bold. Bold and underlined. Okay. Cool. Now, what happens is that that request gets made, and it's going to get sent in a different way depending on what protocol we use. We'll come back to that. But it goes to DNS, the domain name service. It's going to use the host to figure out like where it should get sent to. Think of the domain name service or DNS as like a giant phone book in the internet. There's all these servers around the world called DNS servers that literally have like a listing of every domain, every host with an IP address that it's associated with, meaning this is the computer that hosts this particular website. Okay? So if I were to look up like DNS servers, okay, there's a website where you can look up like your DNS, DNS lookup. I think this is it. Yeah, you would like type in your domain name here. So if I were to type in like alexmercedcoder.com, this actually is going to go find the domain name server and then actually look for what servers keep track of like my domain and stuff. I think that's exactly what I wanted. But the idea here is that there's these servers that literally they act as a phone book. So my request goes to DNS and it's like, well, I'd like to go to xyz.com. And they'll be like, well, xyz.com, the computer that hosts that website is going to be located at this machine, and give it an IP address which it will then go to, or it could give it another name address, which it then has to go look for the host of that. But it will take that, go to that domain, or go to that IP address, okay, and then find the server. Okay, and then the server is going to analyze this request and send a response. Okay, so let me flip this over. Actually, I'll just make a new arrow. Okay, and it's going to send a response. And this response could be in the form of like HTML, could be in the form of text, could be in the form of JSON. Okay, it can come in many, many different forms. Okay, and then the browser will share depending on basically what it is. Like if it's an HTML file, you're going to get a website like this. So like if I go to alexmercedcoder.com, that's going to get routed to one of Netlify's servers, which then sends back the HTML file, the output that makes up this page. Okay, but if I go to, if I remember, it's like dummy API data .netlify pokedex.json, that's a JSON file, and I get back JSON. Okay, and I can see the details. Like if you go over here to your Chrome DevTools and go under here network, I can see the details of the request and response. So like if I refresh, see I see there's the request for the file. So see I sent a request to that website. What kind of request was it? Get, because again a browser always makes a get request. Then you have a status code. The status codes become useful to tell sort of like what the result was. 200 responses generally mean things are okay. So like you get something in the 200s means things did what they were supposed to do. Things in the 300 generally mean like cached. So what this is telling me is that since I refreshed the page and I noticed that I just went to this website, instead of actually re-downloading it again, it just used a cached version. Okay, so if I would actually hold shift in my browser, so if I'm holding the shift key and I hit refresh, it'll actually force it to do like it'll re-download it. So I should get a 200 response. Okay, so I just refreshed it. Now let me click on pokedex.json and see this time I got a 200 response because it actually went and re-downloaded it. Okay, so these are like the IP addresses we're dealing with. So like the server that responded is like this. That's like the IP address, and again it gets that from DNS. And these are all the details of the response. Okay, so generally a lot of the details about the response are done in what's called response headers. Okay, you don't really need to know what all these are. The only one I want to point out is this content type one. So see, the browser knows that this is JSON data because in the headers we said, hey, this is JSON data. And see, we sent a request. This is like the details of our request, what we sent out. Okay, and again, so we went and we sent a request for all this stuff. And then like there's all the details of what the request we sent and the response we received. Okay, so you can see all this data, and it does it for every little thing. Like if I go to alexmercedcoder.com, you're gonna see a whole bunch because there's a lot of photos, and those photos get their own individual request. So you make a website, you don't realize that like that browser is making an individual request for every JavaScript file, for the HTML file, for the CSS file, for every image, for all the fonts you include. It's making an individual request for each thing. Okay, and you can kind of see all these requests right here. Okay, and then sometimes you'll see a 400 request, which means like the request didn't work. Usually this means like you asked for something that doesn't exist. Okay, you made a reference to a URL that doesn't exist. If you get a 500 level response, it means something went wrong with that server. Like you asked for a thing that exists, it just failed. Okay, and again, you don't have to memorize every number, but it's good to kind of know their general idea. Again, 200, 300s aren't bad, 400 and 500s are bad. 500 means the problem's with the server. 400 means the problem is you making the request from the front end. Okay, but there is a good website, so if you want to see like all the different numbers and what they specifically mean, HTTP cat, you can go here and you can take a look at it via cats. See what these different things mean. Okay, so see that was at 304, not modified. So see, since the website hadn't changed, it was not modified, it used the cached version, or the cached version. Okay, I think there's also a dogs version of this, HTTP dogs, status dogs. Yeah, so whatever your preferred animal of choice, you can learn your HTTP status codes. Fun, 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 fun. Okay. So, recap. I type a URL into the browser. That goes to DNS. DNS tells it, hey, here's a server. It goes to the server based on the request. Think of it like, think of the server as kind of like the chefs in the kitchen of your favorite restaurant. They're going to receive the order from the waiter. They're going to prepare the order, and then the waiter then brings the order back to the client who's at the table. Okay, so basically that's why it's called the back end. Like, so kind of like the kitchen and all the chefs. That's the back end of a restaurant, and the front end of a restaurant is like the table and the waiter and the host, who are kind of giving you who are controlling the client experience. But again, at the end of the day, you don't get to eat unless the cooks prepare you the food. But you don't sit there and actually see the cooks most of the time when you're at a restaurant. You don't know how they're cooking your food, or what process they use, or how they got the order, nor do you care. You just care that if I ordered this food, I get that food back. Okay? So the front-end developer is controlling the client experience. They're kind of like, again, using the restaurant analogy, you're deciding, like, how does the table get decorated? What kind of size, what shaped tables? How do we decorate the waiting area? Basically the visual user experience. And how does how do we collect the orders, and how do we deliver them back? That's all going to be happening in the front end. That's all the code that you run in the client browser through HTML, CSS. Okay, so what runs in the browser? HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Okay, the server is the cooks. They prepare the meals that are requested. Okay, whether that's HTML, text, JSON, whatever is being requested. And this can be done in any language, literally any language. The reason why it couldn't be any language is because this is a separate computer. This is not the user's computer. Okay, I can't assume what browser the client is looking at my website on. So I can't assume that they have some special web browser that can run a special language. Theoretically, someone could make one, but this used to be a problem. Like, people would try to create all these like little mini languages and plugins, and say, "Hey, you can do this." But the problem is, you'd have to assume that the user had the thing, like Flash or Silverlight. Assume that they had the thing for your website to work. So nowadays, everyone works on the same standard: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Every browser, whether it's Chrome, whether it's Firefox, whether it is Opera, whether it is Safari, whether it's Edge, they all can understand HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So in that case, that's the reason why when you do front-end work, you do in those three languages, because they work across all browsers. Okay? Theoretically, you could add more, and there's this thing called WebAssembly that's kind of opening up the door. But generally, that's the reason why that's the language you choose there, because it's based on what the user's computer has. And you don't know, are they going to use Chrome? Are they going to use Firefox? Are they going to use Opera? Well, this runs on your computer. This runs on your server machine. Okay, or the server machine run by the hosting company you use. And that could run whatever way you want. Doesn't matter. Okay, cool. So again, I type in the browser. The request gets sent. The server receives the request. The response gets sent. The browser then receives the response and then shows the website on the screen. Okay? Or shows the results on the screen. Okay. So if I send it HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it will then read that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and render it on the screen. Okay, client-side code versus server-side code. Cool. Okay. So now let's go on to sort of the next level. Okay, so I'm going to duplicate the slide and delete all the things. What's going to happen now is that we just have the server. Okay. So using the host, we determine like what IP address. Now what the server is going to care about is the rest of the URL, the endpoint, and maybe a query if we need it. Okay. But oftentimes what's going to happen is that the server has a listener. Okay, so the server is going to have a listener. And we'll say on port 3000. Okay, so one computer, so let's say this is a server machine, and we have lots of different applications that run on this server. So we have one listening on 3000, and there's like a whole bunch of different ports, like so like the max IP port or HTTP port. That's the highest number port. Like that's you could theoretically, if your computer was fast enough, run 65,535 ports. And the purpose of these ports is so that way you could have one application listening to a port, and you can actually have, not only can you receive requests from other computers, but you could also receive requests between applications. So I could have different pieces of software communicating each other. They would just send each other information via these ports, long as one of them is listening on the port. So that's essentially like how your database server will work. The database is on one port, and then I may have my front-end dev environment listening on another port and creating all these different applications that listen on different ports, and they're able to send each other messages. And then other computers can send messages through these ports, etc. Okay, so I set up all these ports. We'll just kind of then just create a few of these. So like here's your application. So these are different applications that are on the same computer. So we'll say this one's on 3003. This one's on port 3002. This port is on 3001. Okay. And then what's going to happen here is that the way we manage all of this is through something called like Apache or Nginx. These are going to be the two things that kind of act as an intermediary. And Apache and Nginx, they're going to be listening on port 80 for anything that has HTTP as the protocol, or listening on port 443 for anything that has HTTPS as the protocol. And again, generally, this is set up by your hosting company. So you create your application, and you deploy it on Netlify or Heroku or Render or Vercel or any of these hosts, and they're going to assign you a port. But basically, if I were to type HTTP in the URL, it would be sent as a request to port 80. That server is going to hear it on port 80. Apache or Nginx is going to have like a bunch of configurations that say, okay, well, if they're asking for this website, send it to this server. If they're asking for this website, send it to this server. So based on the host, it'll send it to the right port. And then here's my application, and my application has generally a layer of middleware. And middleware is essentially just functions that do things. Okay, like they could do a bunch of different things. But the idea is that they're not the response. They don't respond. They don't send something back to the client. They may take the data that came in from the request and modify it a little bit. They may do some processing. They may just print some logging information so that way I can see it on my terminal output. They can do a bunch of different things. But the idea is that the request will go through a chain of middleware. And then once it's done going through all of the middleware, that's why it's called middleware, because it's in the middle between the response and the request. Or the other way around, between the request and the response. Okay, so again, just to kind of paint the picture here. Let me get the arrow. Nope, not that arrow. I don't want that arrow. So request comes in. Then this is sometimes referred to as a reverse proxy server. And then what it does is that this will then send it to the right application on the computer based on the settings. And then your server, your application, will then run it through a bunch of different middleware. Which can do whatever, could be for like authentication purposes, could be setting certain headers, whatever. Eventually, it's going to try to match it up with what's called a route. Okay. A route. And the route is generally a function that actually ends in a response. So it'll actually say at the end, render this HTML here, render this template, or send back this HTML file, or send back this JSON data. It's going to have a response. Okay? And generally, there's a whole bunch of routes. So the question is which one gets hit. So there's generally two variables that are used to determine the route, which route matches. Okay, there's the verb, which in our previous example was get, could be a bunch of different ones, and the endpoint. Okay, so that would be this part of the URL. Okay, so it's going to use that, and based on the way the routes are written in the backend code, it's going to try to match the request after going through all the middleware, match the request with one of these routes. And then that route will specify what to send back. Okay, and then that will then get sent back as HTML, CSS, and JSON. Okay, and there are several different approaches that this could end up taking. Okay, so let's go here. Let's change this a little bit. We'll say this is the route. So suddenly your request finds the route that it matches, that matches it, and it might do several different things before it gets to sends a response. Okay, so we'll put that all the way over here. Sends response all the way over here. And oftentimes it'll get data first. Okay, so, and these are generally what's referred to as your controllers, your routes. So let's write routes. So these are called like your controller / actions. So generally like a controller is like a batch of routes, and an action is the function for one individual route. But you'll see that terminology. And then it'll make, let's say, get data from whatever source. Could be a database, could be another API, could be whatever. And then send, then render a template, and then send the final HTML. Okay, so that's what we refer to as server-side rendering. Okay, that means the server renders the HTML file. Like, you didn't pre-write the HTML file. You might have pre-wrote the template, but the actual HTML file gets built on the fly. Then there's static rendering, where basically send a pre-existing HTML file. So when you're using like Netlify, this is how it's basically sending your website. You've already written the HTML and CSS files, whether you're using like Vercel, Render, using any kind of static deployment. Essentially, you're pre-making the website. Everything's kind of already in the file. Nothing's being made at the time. So basically, when the request comes in, it just takes the file and sends it down. It doesn't actually have to generate the file. Okay, and then the other typical thing to do is get the data, send back as JSON. And this is what's referred to as like building an API. So when people talk about APIs, this is generally what their server's doing. When you think of like full stack websites, this is generally what their website's doing. They're rendering templates, maybe a little bit of this. But they get the data, send back the JSON, and then generally they'll have a separate front-end application that's making requests for that data that'll then separately like render it using a framework like Angular, React, Vue, Svelte, or something like that. And essentially that is the process. Like, that's all a backend server does. It receives a response, so a request comes into the server. Okay, the server generally has like some sort of server-wide server. That server then directs it to the right mini server for that particular application. Because again, Netlify or Heroku hosts millions of websites, maybe not millions, but probably at least 100,000, maybe multiple hundreds of thousands of websites. So they got to direct it to the right server for the right website. And then that server is going to direct that request through a bunch of middleware, which is just intermediate actions of any type. And then eventually it'll hit the route, and the route will respond in some sort of way. And then that response gets sent back to the client and gets run in the browser. That's So anything that happens between here, so anything that happens between the request and the response, that's backend development. Anything that happens here on the server is backend development. Any code that gets read and run in the browser is front-end development. Okay? Doing both is full stack development. So hopefully this brings you some clarity on this topic. My name is Alex Merced from Alex Merced Coder. Again, make sure to hit the subscribe button, like the video, and make sure to join the Slack and Discord community over there at devnursery.com. Have a great day and enjoy.